now resumed.
Mr. Commissioner, we have present today Paul Steele, Randy Nelson, and Manon Bombardier, who will be part of a panel giving evidence for 3 days, today, tomorrow, and Monday, on the topic of habitat enforcement. If I might, I'd like to take a few moments to cover some initial matters and offer you a few remarks to preface this part of our hearings. As with previous hearings, I'll be making reference to Commission Council's exhibit list as I move through my questions. I won't be introducing every single document on that list, but I'll move through it, and thanks to Ms. Grant's excellent organization for once, largely in the order they appear on the list. The other initial point I'll make is that as was the case for habitat management, these are not hearings that focus on particular habitat or habitat enforcement issues, which is to say the subtopics of, for example, aquaculture, mining, other topics for which there is hearing time later on. So we're trying to keep it at a general level, but appreciating that there may be areas where we need to zero in on a particular topic. Ms. Bombardier, we're making arrangements for her to appear on Monday by video because she'll be back in Ottawa or Gatineau at that point. So I'll advise that, and we'll speak to that further likely towards the end of the day tomorrow. One of the preliminary matters I'd like to address is the policy and practice report. Mr. Bissett can bring that up on the screen. This is a policy and practice report entitled Enforcement of the Habitat Protection and Pollution Prevention Provisions of the Fisheries Act. It's on our exhibit list as number 4. This is, to be clear, a different policy and practice report, or PPR, than was used and entered as PPR number 8. That was the habitat management PPR. This is the habitat enforcement PPR, and I'd ask at this juncture to have that marked as a PPR in the proceedings, please.
It'll be marked as PPR number 9.
Another preliminary matter, which is really just to clean up a matter outstanding from hearings over the past few days on habitat management. You may recall that Mr. Harrison put to the panel, I think on Tuesday, a David Suzuki report called High and Dry. And to have that perhaps at hand, it was marked as Exhibit W for identification, I believe. I've spoken with Council for Canada as well as Council for the Conservation Coalition. We have some agreement that it's appropriate to do two things. The first thing is to have Exhibit W for identification marked as an exhibit proper in these proceedings. I'd like to do that now, please.
That'll be marked as exhibit number 682, and the caveat W for identification will be removed.
Thank you, Mr. Registrar. The second part to this is to ask that some documents provided by Canada also be entered as exhibits in order to complete the documentary record in relation to the High and Dry report. And as I say, Mr. Harrison is in agreement that that's appropriate in the circumstances. The first document I'll have brought up, please, is an October 12, 2007 memorandum for the Minister. I'd ask that to be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 683.
Next, there's an email, July 25, 2007, from Ed Wu.
Sorry, what was the last exhibit? Can you just bring that back up on the screen? Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Commissioner. It's a memorandum for the Minister. You'll see in the title of that, it refers specifically to the David Suzuki Foundation report on habitat enforcement.
Sorry, who's the author of this document?
I'd have to flip to the end to tell you that. You'll see Mr. Taylor may be able to assist.
Michelle Doré, I apologize if I mispronounced the last name. She was the Deputy Minister before Ms. Dansereau was the Deputy Minister. So she signed it, but the authors are variously Mr. or Miss Winfield, Patrice LeBlanc, who you of course remember from earlier this week, A.D. McBain, S. Kirby, and these are, and what Mr. Martland is going to come to, essentially they are responses and briefings on responses to Exhibit W that has now become Exhibit 682.
Thank you.
And thank you for that clarification. The next part of this is an email from Ed Wu as I say, dated July 25, 2007. And it provides some context for the document I'll put forward in a moment, as well as it describes a meeting that's going on in relation to this David Suzuki Foundation report. And I'd ask that that email please be marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 684.
And Mr. Giles may have missed a number. 683 was the memorandum from Minister, and 684 is this one.
That's correct.
Thank you. And finally, there's a memorandum for the Deputy Minister. It has a 2007 date on it. DFO response to David Suzuki Foundation DSF report on habitat enforcement. That's now on the screen. And this, on the third page of that document, it has again the name S. Kirby and D. Bevan as the people signing that. There's a number of authors who are listed on the page afterwards. And this document has some appendixes. Again, it would be put in for the same purpose of completing the documentary record in relation to the David Suzuki report. I'd ask that this document, including appendixes, be 685 as exhibit, please.
So marked as exhibit 685.
Mr. Commissioner, those points having been addressed, these panel members can now be affirmed, and I'll commence my questioning, please.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
I do. Yes.
State your name, please.
Manon Bombardier.
Paul Steele, Randy Nelson.
Thank you. Counsel?
Thank you. Panel members, I'll begin with your backgrounds, and I'll do this in a fairly quick manner, and I'll begin, Mr. Steele, if I might, with you. And I'll ask Mr. Bissett to please draw up number 1 on Commission Council's list of exhibit. And I'll just, when that comes up, I expect, Mr. Steele, you'll see that's your resume. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
I'm sorry, we'll need to pay attention. There's a red light on these mics, so thank you. You've confirmed that that's your resume.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I'd ask that be marked as an exhibit, please.
Exhibit 686.
And I'll just ask a long-winded question to cover your background. I take it you, Mr. Steele, have a degree in political science and economics from Acadia University, that you began working for the DFO in 1980, initially in the area of economics and statistics, and then joined the Conservation and Protection Program, or C&P program, in 1985 as a staff officer. And I understand that in 1992 you became Chief of Enforcement Programs at the C&P Directorate. Is that correct?
Yes.
In 2001 you became Director of the Enforcement Branch of C&P, and in turn in 2005 Director General of the Directorate on a national level. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And in that position, which you held, I understand, until very recently, until 18th of March 2011, you were responsible for C&P's national program budgets, providing functional direction to the regional directors, coordinating the development of national policies and procedures relating to the Fisheries Enforcement Program, directing the establishment of strategic priorities for the program nationally, and overseeing the recruitment and training of fishery officers and other C&P staff. Is that all accurate?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Nelson, I'll have next Mr. Bissett draw up number 2 on our list of exhibits, please. Mr. Nelson, you'll recognize that as your CV, is that correct?
It's correct, somewhat dated, but it is.
All right, and I'll ask that be marked as exhibit 687, please, Mr. Giles.
Will be so marked, 687.
Mr. Nelson, you have some 34 years of experience working for DFO in protection, conservation, enforcement, and management of fisheries and habitat resources. I understand you began your work with the department as a fisheries officer and have continued in that role, working up to the ranks of area chief and ultimately to your current position of regional director of C&P. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I understand in that role as regional director from 2006 to 2008, you were acting in that capacity. You then competed for and were appointed into that position in 2008.
Yes, that's correct.
And I understand that you spent some 20 years in the BC Interior region developing habitat enforcement expertise. Indeed, in the course of that, at one point spending 1.5 years on a single hydro investigation.
That's correct.
Currently, you are in charge of all CNP's fishery officers in this province?
Yes, this province and the Yukon.
Thank you. And Ms. Bombardier, I'll look to number 3 on our exhibit list. You recognize that as your CV?
Yes.
And formally, I suppose I should be saying Dr. Bombardier. I think you'd indicated to us that you were, I don't know if you prefer Dr. or Ms. Bombardier for today's purposes.
Ms. Bombardier is fine.
Thank you. And I've put that document on screen and confirmed it without having that marked. If that could please be marked as an exhibit.
688.
Ms. Bombardier, you have a PhD in environmental toxicology from the Université de Metz in France, and in the 1990s held various positions as a researcher or biologist. And then from 2000 to 2003, I understand that you worked with Environment Canada's Environmental Science and Technology Centre in Ottawa, and in that role building departmental capacity in relation to soil toxicology and biotechnology.
Yes, that's correct.
In 2003, you became head of the risk evaluation section of the New Substances Division of Environment Canada, and in 2006, you took on the role of director of the headquarters office for the Environmental Enforcement Directorate, or EED. Is that correct?
Yes, I was deputy director, yes.
And in that capacity, you were responsible for overseeing and coordinating environmental enforcement operations, including functional direction to the 5 regional offices across Canada.
That's correct.
From late 2009 until early 2010, I understand you served briefly as the director of the National Support Program for the CEAA, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, and that since May of 2010, you've been in the position of National Director of Environment Canada's Environmental Enforcement Directorate, and in that capacity overseeing the operations and functions of the Directorate?
Yes, that's correct.
I'll begin, and the context for my questions and the evidence we're leading includes the Policy and Practice Report, or PPR, which I know you've been provided and I understand have all read. And so to some extent I may ask questions that presume a collective understanding of some material that's covered in that report. As the PPR sets out, the responsibilities for the administration of the habitat, the main habitat protection provisions in the Fisheries Act, which is to say sections 35 and 36 of the Fisheries Act, is split between DFO administering and enforcing section 35 and Environment Canada administering and enforcing section 36. The PPR really sets out some of that background, and I understand that developed through the 1970s, was formalized through ultimately a prime ministerial directive and then an MOU between the 2 departments. The question I have with all of that is the background for this split responsibility arrangement, if you will, and I'll begin, for these questions, I'll begin, Mr. Steele, with you and then move to the other panel members. Could you please comment generally on how well that arrangement works? And if it's helpful or appropriate to do so, how well does this split in responsibility work for on-the-ground officers, for policymakers, for enforcement officers and enforcement branch, for scientists, for ministers, if you can comment to that effect? How well does the split work?
Generally speaking, I think I would say that the split works reasonably well the closer you are to the field level. From my experience and from what I hear from our own field staff, I think generally the working arrangements are quite good, and clear arrangements are in place in terms of an understanding of roles and responsibilities. Good interaction at the field level between our officers and DOE officers. I think it's, from my perspective, as you move higher up, probably in both, or at least on the DFO side, I can't really speak for Environment Canada, but I think the
There's probably more room for improvement as you move higher up in the organization. Speaking at the Ottawa level, there are, I think, some shortcomings in terms of lack of regular contact and communication at the higher level, my own level, and even director level, for example, in Ottawa. A lot of reasons for that, but I think it's pretty apparent that there is room for improvement in that respect. And the other comment I would make generally, I can't really speak about the how well the arrangement works for the science program. I'm not familiar enough with the workings of the science program to be able to comment on that. But generally speaking, I would say that there does tend to be some confusion, I would say, on the part of probably the public, but also within government, certainly within our organization. I've heard accounts of that from field staff and others. Some confusion as to who should handle particular files, respective roles and responsibilities. Both organizations, I would say, are faced with workload and resource issues, so sometimes I think there may be a tendency to rely on the other party to take responsibility for certain files. So I think that's an issue as well. But from my perspective, from my understanding at least, at the field level, and Mr. Nelson could probably speak better about the regional headquarters from the regional headquarters perspective, but my understanding, at least at the field level, there is a good working relationship and a reasonably good understanding of roles and responsibilities.
Mr. Nelson, why don't I pick up on that suggestion and ask for your views on this, please?
Yes, I would agree with what Mr. Steele has said on the arrangement. I'll speak more to the Pacific region, starting from the field level, which is the most important. I think officers do have a very good understanding of who plays what role. Certainly in the eyes of the public, it can be confusing at times because there is not just Environment Canada and DFO, there's a provincial role to play in this sometimes where it's not in anadromous waters. There's sometimes links to Coast Guard and to Transport Canada as well. But as far as the field officers, we as in conservation and protection, our fishery officers are much more decentralized. We're located in 35 offices throughout BC and the Yukon, where as Environment Canada are more of a centralized group. They have recently received some more officers and are starting to become more decentralized. So that's important to understand, because when an issue comes up for Environment Canada, they may call on us to be the first responders to a situation, and we do that, and we'll gather initial information, then contact Environment Canada to take over the case if it's one of theirs involving Section 36 issues. So as far as moving up at the regional level here, my counterparts, as a manager at my level with Environment Canada, we're in the same building. They've gone through a number of turnover, actors coming through the role, and the current person occupying that position, I've had initial discussions with. We're going to be getting together to discuss how we can work more together.
And Mr. Steele described confusion. From your point of view, is that the case?
From the public point of view, I would say yes. That sometimes we do field complaints from the public. They are confused as to who might respond to it. But I think internally, our staff are well informed and know whose role it is.
Ms. Bombardier, I'd like to ask you the very same question, which at a general level is simply, how well does this split work from your perspective?
I would agree with what Mr. Steele said in terms of at the field level. It seems to be working fairly well. I'm not in the region, I'm in the national headquarters, but talking with my staff in the region, I I'm of the opinion that it works fairly well. Staff understand their responsibilities under 36.3 and they understand the responsibilities of DFO under 35.1. So they're well trained and experienced, and when they're in doubt, they will seek guidance from senior officers or managers in terms of determining who should be the lead agency. There's been a significant turnover, as Mr. Nelson indicated, in the BC, Pacific and Yukon Office of Environment Canada. In the past 2 years, we've had significant retirements in senior officers. We've had retirement of our previous regional director. We have a new regional director that's been with Enforcement Branch for a long time, but he's new to the environmental pollution side. So we have to rebuild those partnerships that existed before with DFO. At the national level, I would agree again with Mr. Still that there's room for improvement in terms of improving communication, sharing of information, perhaps joint planning of activities in the area of Fisheries Act. I'm new as National Director. We have a new Chief Enforcement Officer as well, so there's been quite a number of changes too at the National Headquarters Office of Environment Canada's Enforcement Branch. So we have to rebuild those partnerships, but we've already started working on that.
And I'll continue with some further questions to pick up, I think, on some of the points you've all just addressed. And one of them is as follows, and I'll begin this question with you, Ms. Bombardier. It arises out of a point Mr. Steele alluded to, and we've heard, in particular through our public submission, a concern or complaint that the split in responsibility between Section 35 and Section 36 creates the setting for a situation where, as between two departments, to use the expression, it's easy to pass the buck, and that it's easy for one department to say that it's another department's responsibility to investigate or deal with a particular occurrence. This arises out of a public submission, but I'm not speaking about the particular public submission so much as that sort of a concern or problem or difficulty. The concern being simply that in that context, there may be a perception, or it may be the case, that neither department ultimately steps up to the plate and addresses the problem. As I say, Ms. Bombardier, if I might start with you, and if you could offer a response to that criticism. What do you do to ensure that that does not happen?
As Mr. Nelson indicated, at Environment Canada, especially in the Pacific and Yukon BC region, we are not as decentralized as DFO is. We have 6 offices, so we have officers in small offices across the province. Some offices we have 2 officers, so we definitely have a capacity limitation there. So we try to work very well with our partners, and but our ability to be on site when there's a spill that triggers 36.3 is limited in remote areas. That's why we have operational working agreements and arrangements with DFO and other partners. So that the department or the organization who's the closest to the scene is asked often to go and attend and collect samples and take statements on behalf of Environment Canada, and we do the same if we are closer as well. Now, the fact that the first responder may not be Environment Canada may be perceived by the public as we're passing the buck. It's not the case. It's whoever is closest to the area where the spill is. So we try to work in partnership because of our respective limited capacity. And for us, it's definitely a challenge in very remote areas.
Mr. Nelson, could I ask you to comment on that concern? And I'll ask some more questions in due course about the nature of resourcing or decentralization and so forth to get a fuller picture of that. But maybe I can start with one obvious question. If Environment Canada has some 6, if I understand, Ms. Bombardier, your answer, if I took it correctly, was that there's 6 offices. Is that in the province, or is there a region that the Environment Canada uses?
There's 5 in the province of BC and 1 in Whitehorse.
All right, and maybe I should ask this: does Environment Canada's region, is it the Pacific and Yukon? And I don't know if you can comment on whether that's the same or comparable to DFO's
Our Pacific and Yukon office and it covers BC and the Yukon territories.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Nelson, if you could, at the outset, perhaps tell us how many offices or locations does C&P have officers in throughout the province? I'll frame the question that way, and then ask you to comment after that on this concern about so-called passing the buck.
We have 35 offices in BC and 1 in the Yukon. And we have approximately 180 officers located in the region. As far as passing the buck, maybe the best way would be to describe an example that was a couple of years ago where a barge had a truck on it that had a large amount of fuel, and the barge sank in an area known as Robson Bight, where there was a very sensitive whale habitat. This is a classic example of it involves a whole number of agencies. Coast Guard are the agency that's supposed to respond to a spill, so they are involved to help clean up any spill. Environment Canada it's more likely their file. However, they don't have people in the area where this was, so fisher officers responded. We had a vessel available, and we immediately responded to the site, started gathering evidence, collecting information. And it also can involve Transport Canada because it is a vessel. So Transport Canada has a role to play in it as well. And if in this case it didn't happen, but had the oil got ashore and starts damaging to some of the shoreline, it could involve province as well. So in this case, it worked very well where we did the initial investigation, turned it over to Environment Canada, and generally that's how we try and do it. It is going to become more and more challenging as budgets become tighter in all agencies. The ability to make those responses is going to be more difficult in future years. But I would say, as it is now, it works very well.
Let me pick up on a point I think that Mr. Steele, you raised earlier or suggested in your answer, which was that to some extent this may be a public perception. I'm interested in having comments, and I'll ask you that, Mr. Steele, now. To what extent is this a public perception, or the public, perhaps that's a communication problem, as opposed to a problem of substance, in that in reality, are there situations where neither agency addresses it, or the file notionally bounces across the net with neither agency stepping up?
I can't speak about any particular situations where that occurs, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were situations like that. It's difficult to gauge, I guess, public opinion on something like this, but it would not, again, it wouldn't surprise me if the public perception is that the situation is somewhat worse than it actually is. And I think you're right that there probably is a bit of a communications issue there in terms of both departments getting out the message to the public as to respective roles and responsibilities.
Do you have any suggestions for what could be done to address that concern? Nothing specific other than to say perhaps in making announcements of enforcement actions that have been taken, perhaps as part of that press release or announcement that's made, there could be an explanation given, I suppose, as to what actions were taken by which department and how that relates back to mandates and legislative responsibilities, that kind of thing. I think oftentimes we probably assume that the public is aware of those issues, and that may not always be the case. Ms. Bombardier, Mr. Nelson, any comments or suggestions following up on that question about whether there are particular suggestions that you have on how that issue can be addressed?
Yeah, I think always we can always do a better job of communicating with the public, and that could be. We have a system where when cases happen, we have a very lengthy process to get approvals to release information on cases and violations. And I think what I'd like to see us as an agency is have a trained media liaison officer, like a lot of enforcement agencies, to when we have a case that comes up we're able to respond to the public and address questions immediately. Now, I know that may be a pretty big thing to wish for, but it would certainly help improve the public awareness of what all the agencies do and what each role is to play, and providing the public with more timely information on what's happening. A lot of the public, often we get caught in a neighbor dispute where a neighbor doesn't like a neighbor and he sees somebody throw a wheelbarrow full of grass clippings in a creek. Those are the kind of little complaints that can generate a complaint. And the neighbor isn't happy that that we're not taking the fellow to court. So there's a lot of times where the public isn't happy with that, and if they're not happy with what they do, they can complain, and sometimes those are what the complaints are, fairly minor. Sometimes they're real. But generally speaking, I think that would be the biggest thing we could do, is improve our communications in how we present information about cases.
Ms. Bombardier, anything to add to those points?
I agree with what was said earlier. There's always room for improvement in terms of communicating and providing more information to the general public on our roles, responsibilities. At Environment Canada, we have strong support from our communications branch in terms of issuing news releases or notifications on our website, enforcement branch website, on cases that have gone to court. Unfortunately, we're not there yet for administrative measures. It's only for successful prosecutions for now. But there is, I agree, an opportunity to perhaps add a few lines to clarify what the role of Environment Canada is, as opposed to DFO's role in a particular case, or how we've worked together in that particular instance. So.
And just out of interest, when you say the website is used for successful prosecutions, that suggests that the information, or at least information about a case, may only be posted in the event that the case concludes with a conviction or a guilty plea?
Yes, that's the case.
So there wouldn't be publication of information at the charging stage in that scenario?
No.
Thank you. I'll move Mr. Nelson to asking you, and I just clarify that I'm not asking you to act as a public survey or give us survey evidence per se, but we've heard that some DFO fishery officers perceive that Environment Canada enforcement officers, given all the competing demands that they have, do not make fish habitat work a priority. From your point of view, is that the case?
I think the Environment Canada role is to deal, is probably has, and I should probably let Ms. Bombardier answer this, but it's more of a focus on human health and water quality. That seems to be more the issues they address. But I'll ask her to respond to that.
Environment Canada has expertise on pollution type incidents, so anything that involves substance, an effluent or chemical or oil, anything that can be deleterious to fish that is of industrial origin, that's where Environment Canada has typical expertise.
I'd like to bring up, Mr. Bissett, please, number 5 on our list of exhibits. The first page is a news release, but if we flip past that, I'll suggest that you'll see the Memorandum of Understanding. I referred to it earlier. It dates to May of 1985. Do you recognize that as being the MOU addressing what was then Section 33 of the Fisheries Act, now Section 36? Mr. Steele, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
I'll ask this be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 689.
This document is some 25 years old now, and we have some understanding of a process underway to update this. If we set aside for a moment that question about review or renewal of the document, what I'd like to ask about is, from this document, how much of this arrangement is being implemented and is followed today? And to put some flesh on the bones of that question, this document makes reference, and I won't ask them, we won't need to go there on the screen, but amongst other things, it refers to ADMs meeting on an annual basis. It refers to having annual reviews of this MOU between the two arms of government. Could you comment, please, and I'll begin with Mr. Steele and then ask Ms. Bombardier, to what extent is this document being implemented?
In the sense of annual meetings and annual reviews, my understanding is that those do not occur on an annual basis. Not to say that meetings don't occur at the Assistant Deputy Minister level, but from the best of my knowledge, the requirement specified in the document for annual reviews and annual meetings has not been followed through on.
And to round out that picture, I take it one of the obvious major points of this document is the very arrangement splitting responsibility between the two departments. That part of it is in effect. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Ms. Bombardier?
The MOU covers a wide range of activities that Environment Canada is involved in. Administration, enforcement is there, research, so I can only speak to an enforcement component. Mm-hmm. My understanding is that there is work being done at the departmental level to renew that MOU with DFO. On the enforcement side, as you know, we have regional working agreements that are kind of annexes to that MOU that talks about how this MOU is being implemented at the regional level. So for that aspect, the enforcement aspect, except for the what we discussed earlier at the National Headquarters Office, where there's room for improvement in terms of collaboration and information sharing, at the regional level, my understanding is that it's being well implemented.
And perhaps I can bring up a document that I think will indeed be one of those regional working agreements you just referred to, number 6, I believe. Let me ask, first of all, this dates to May of 1987, regional working agreement between Department of Environment and DFO, referring to Section 33, in particular in the BC and Yukon. Is that an example of one of the regional working agreements?
Yes, that's one, but again, this one includes more activities than just enforcement.
And I'll ask that this document please be marked, this is number 6 on our list of exhibits, if it could please be marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 690.
And since I'm into these, maybe I can continue with one further document and then ask a question or two. Mm-hmm. The next tab in the next number in our exhibit list, number 7, is entitled Interim Operational Working Arrangement on Enforcement of Section 36.3 between Environment Canada and DFO for Pacific and Yukon. It dates to 2006. Is that correct, Ms. Bombardier?
Yes, that's an enforcement operational agreement.
All right, I'll ask that be marked as the next exhibit, please.
691.
And the question that comes out of that is, to what extent are these documents being employed and followed? And how often are they being referred to by CNP or the Enforcement Branch of Environment Canada? Ms. Bombardier, I'll start with you if I may.
Again, that's a question at the regional level, but my understanding, based on my discussions with Regional Director of Pacific and Yukon and staff from that region, is that arrangement is working very well. It outlines the roles, responsibilities of both departments in responding to spills. So there's a protocol. It sets out the protocol on the steps or the process for responding to spills, and where the DFO or Environment Canada or the province in some particular cases may take the lead.
Mr. Steele.
I'm not sure I would be able to comment on how they're actually put into practice regionally. I know they exist, but how they're actually used, I wouldn't be able to comment.
That's fine. I'll ask Mr. Nelson, please, then.
Yeah, this was signed several months before I came into the position, and I have seen the document, received the document when I was an area chief. It's been distributed throughout the region.
I'm sorry, I just paused to confirm. Which document are you referring to when you say this document? Because I managed to put two things before you.
Yeah.
You're talking about the
February 1st, 06. Yes, the document on the screen. Yes.
Carry on, please.
Yeah. And could we do a better job of reminding staff of it? Probably could. I can't speak for staff throughout the organization when's the last time they've looked at this or reviewed this. But you had mentioned about some officers perhaps not being feeling that Environment Canada had not responded to. That does happen occasionally. Some officers may feel the response time by Environment Canada isn't fast enough. There are also cases where an officer may feel it is a violation and should be acted on, and it may not be a priority of Environment Canada. So things aren't perfect, but this document helps direct officers to do the job as best they can.
Mr. Nelson, prior to our work as Commission Counsel speaking to you and putting this document forward and asking you questions about it, to what extent were you reaching for this document and using it on a month-to-month basis in your position?
Not very often.
And are there annual reviews under either of these two, whether it's the interim operational working arrangement or the document before that, the regional working agreement?
Not that I've done.
Let me try and step back and ask the broader question, and Mr. Nelson, I'll continue with you if I may. From your perspective, on a regional level, what could be done to improve the working relationship between DFO and Environment Canada on enforcement matters?
Well, we have taken some initial measures. As I explained, I met initially with my counterpart several years ago, and there's been a rotation of air actors through. The most recent person that's in the job now, I have had initial discussions with him, and we intend on getting together in the near future. It was only a couple of weeks ago where we actually contacted, because he had only been in the job for a short time.
From your point of view, are the improvements that may occur best done through new documents, new agreements, or through more practical work and people meeting and working together?
A combination. I mean, it's good to have a document like this as a guide, as a fallback, but it's more important to, I feel, to get the working staff together. And as a step we tried to do, we have every 2 years we have a meeting where we get all of our officers together. We invited Conservation Officer Service and Environment Canada officers to attend that, and we did get attendance from a couple of them. So to me, that's the most important thing, is to get them together and talking at the field level, and we have to do our part at the senior level as well.
Mr. Steele, from a national perspective, what do you suggest might be done to improve the working relationship between the two departments?
I think the same issues that Mr. Nelson talked about apply at the national level, probably even to a greater extent. As I mentioned earlier, there has been, at least since I've been in this position, there has been, I wouldn't say a total lack of communication, but a lack of regular communication, and a lack of a process to bring that about. So I think that's probably an area that could be looked at, is to develop a framework or a process to make sure that that regular contact does occur. Not to say that there's not any communication or contact between the two agencies at the Ottawa level, but it generally happens on a particular issue that comes up as they come up, as opposed to any sort of pre-planned annual or semi-annual type meetings. So I think that's an area that would need to be looked at. And the other issue, as Ms. Bombardier had mentioned earlier, there has been a fair amount of turnover on the Environment Canada side. Our organization is going through that currently as well, with my replacement coming into place 2 weeks ago. But there have been efforts recently, just in the last couple of weeks. There's been a meeting between the respective DGs on both sides, Directors General, both new to the position, with their senior staff, and from what I understand, a commitment from that to carry on with more regular meetings in future. So I think that's probably, if there's one thing that could be done to improve the relationship, I think that would be the one.
Who is your replacement?
My replacement is Trevor Swartfager, formerly the DG of Aquaculture.
Ms. Bombardier, I'd appreciate your perspective and Environment Canada's perspective on steps that may be taken to improve the working relationship on enforcement.
I think stability of staff is critical, and as was indicated before, Environment Canada, there's been quite a number of turnover over the past 2 years. We've had actors in the regional director's position. We have new managers in all positions are occupied by new managers who were staff of the enforcement branch before, but they're new in their management function, so they need to be aware of those regional agreements and make sure that they apply them and they provide the training to their staff. So stability and basically training of our managers and making sure they make those regular contacts with their counterparts is key. An area of improvement I think that would be worthwhile looking at is integrating those agreements into our basic enforcement training, our training to our new officers coming in, regional training as well, and we could do that jointly with DFO. We have done also some postmortems of cases, enforcement cases. Having those activities, postmortems together would be helpful as well in terms of sharing experience, clarifying roles, responsibilities, lessons learned, and that's good training for staff as well.
And I should pick up on those 2 points. And Mr. Steele and Mr. Nelson, could you comment, either of you, on those 2 suggestions, integrating this into the training for officers and in some situations running a post-mortem of cases that have been done?
I think both are good suggestions. My understanding that the current training that we deliver to fishery officer recruits would include at least a very general overview of the various memorandums of understanding that we have with other departments, including Environment Canada, respective roles and responsibilities. There is pretty extensive training provided on habitat issues generally, which would get into the issues of our relationship with Department of Environment and respective roles and responsibilities. But I think it is a good suggestion to say we could look at joint training opportunities, sharing of trainers, review of successful cases. I think those are all good suggestions, yes.
From a resourcing or cost perspective, is that within reach to, if that were determined to be an appropriate change to make, is that something that's within reach under current resourcing, or would it require more resources? If so, how much?
I would say it's something that's within reach. I wouldn't say it's a major. The cost would not be a major factor if we're looking at training of recruits as a start. If we were to look at expanding that into ongoing training of regular officers who are out in the field and who need to be brought together for training courses, then there would be some cost involved. But to provide that initial training at the recruit level, I don't think cost would be a major factor.
Mr. Nelson, any comments on those 2 suggestions?
I think they are good suggestions. Training, I'm not familiar with the exact training that we provide. We do provide an extensive training to our new officers and habitat training, and I expect the Environment Canada relationship is a part of that. Post-mortem on files, I think, is also important. I think it could also benefit to include provincial agency, the Conservation Officer Service, in this, because there is a role that they play in some of these matters as well. So I think it would be important to include them. And one thing I forgot to mention on the previous question on I have a staff member, Chief of Program Planning and Analysis, that did meet on an annual basis with Environment Canada to discuss our MOU. 2 years ago, that person has moved on, and I don't know that the new person has done the same.
Mr. Martin, I wonder if I could just, on these points you've raised, just ask a couple of brief questions. You mentioned in your discussion, and the example you gave earlier included Coast Guard and Transport Canada, and now you've just mentioned the province, who would have agencies as well. Can I ask you just, from the enforcement side, whether there's any even informal arrangements with any of these other agencies? Or is this just something that happens on an ad hoc basis? Something else that you might address for me is whether there's differences between the marine and freshwater side of your roles and working with others. Something else that came to mind, I think one of you mentioned it, but I'm not sure where you go with this, but police and fire at the local level today are engaged not just in protection, but also in prevention. And do you have any role at all in modern times becoming engaged in those areas? And I'm thinking, as we sit here today in one of North America's most major harbors, how do you address these issues from the point of view of Environment Canada and Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
There's a few topics that come out of those questions, and so I invite witnesses to proceed in the sequence you'd like, and I'll try and make sure we do come back to all three. I think the first question relates to the question of other government departments in the province in particular, and whether there are informal or formal, for that matter, working arrangements. Mr. Nelson, why don't I start with you for that, please?
Yeah, there is a similar type MOU with the province. With Transport Canada, I can't say for sure. Coast Guard are part of the department, so obviously working closely with them is a given. So just that's the only comment I have on that question.
And I should narrate for a moment to say I will return, because we have some documents on our list, numbers 8 and 9, that pick up on the province in particular. But let me ask to follow up, are there, apart from formal agreements, are there practical working arrangements with, for example, Transport Canada or other federal agencies?
I think there has been with Transport Canada, but I honestly don't know if there is right now.
On a day-to-day level, though, do you know who to phone? Would an officer know who to phone at Transport Canada? Would they have a contact? Is there?
Yeah, the officers know who to get a hold of. They deal with Transport Canada on a number of issues dealing with vessels, so they know who to get a hold of.
Ms. Bombardier.
With regards to Transport Canada, Environment Canada has a formal MOU with Transport on the marine pollution from vessels. Usually Transport will take the lead under the Canada Shipping Act, but Environment Canada does have a role to play under Section 36.3. We also have enforcement responsibilities under wildlife legislations, species at risk, migratory birds that may also be impacted by oil spills. So wildlife enforcement, environmental enforcement, we work, and DFO and Coast Guard as well, we work together, but Transport, we have a formal MOU with them, specifically relating to oil spills in the marine environment.
Mr. Steele, anything to add on those points?
Nothing in particular. I'm not aware that we have an MOU at the national level with Transport Canada. Particularly on the issues that we're discussing here, but I'm not sure that there are any MOUs on habitat or fisheries enforcement issues with Transport Canada. With the Coast Guard, of course, we work very closely on the fisheries enforcement side of the house, but not so directly on the habitat issues, and no formal arrangements or documents between us and the Coast Guard that I'm aware of either, relating specifically to fisheries habitat issues. On the fisheries enforcement side, yes, we do have those arrangements in place.
Mr. Commissioner, I think your second question asked about the marine and freshwater work and the difference between the two. Why don't I start again with Mr. Nelson on that question, please?
Yeah, there would be a difference in the freshwater. If it's not dealing with a salmon, then it becomes more of a provincial matter for the Conservation Officer Service, and it can involve provincial on coastal issues as well, but not as likely.
Ms. Bombardier or Mr. Steele, anything to add on that distinction between freshwater and marine environments and the enforcement work that's done?
No, I would agree with Mr. Nelson that if it's freshwater, the province would probably take a larger role. But for us, in terms of Environment Canada, it's the same. Our role doesn't change whether it's freshwater or marine. 36.3 would apply if there's a deleterious substance being released into fish-bearing water.
The other, and I'll just mention this so it's clear, the other part to this question had to do not simply with other federal agencies but the province. I'll plan to come back to that topic for both agencies in a short while, because I have some documents to take you to cover that point. As I believe the third question the Commissioner asked you, in the context of work, for example, that police and fire departments do, is not simply a matter of waiting for the 911 call. There's a preventative or a proactive aspect to that. And again, we may pick up on that theme a bit further down the road, but let's go to that now. And I suppose the question is really at a broad, well, it's your question, Mr. Commissioner, but one aspect of the question, it seems to me, is that at a broad level, to have people conduct themselves responsibly and not have negative impacts on fish habitat, there's a range of things that a government can do to try and accomplish that aim, and they run the gamut from encouraging and proactively promoting compliance, I think is the language the Environment Canada often uses, compliance promotion, and to, on the other side of the spectrum, a policing type of response when someone has done something that's offside. How do you look to strike the balance between the two? Why don't I start, Ms. Bombardier, with you, please?
I can only speak on enforcement because compliance promotion falls under the environmental stewardship branch at Environment Canada, so under another ADM. We do work very closely together, though, in terms of joint planning. But if I understand the question is about how we work with police organizations, and I'll focus on enforcement. We occasionally call RCMP for assistance. Our officers don't carry sidearms. If we're aware of a situation that may become challenging in terms of health and safety for our officers, we will call the RCMP to assist us or accompany us for search warrants, for example, if we're expecting some resistance, the RCMP may be asked to assist. We also ask for their assistance in terms of having access to their databases on criminal records. So before we do inspections, we always check if regulators have a criminal record, and again, we ask for assistance from the RCMP for that.
Mr. Nelson?
Yeah, on the topic of prevention, within this region, we try and set a goal of having about 10% of our fishery officers' time worked on what's called education stewardship activities. And I just wrote down a few here that relate to all fisheries, but tried to where they do include habitat enforcement, working with the media, taking the media out on a boat ride to do an article about what's happening on the Fraser River. We've done that in a number of areas, and it's really benefited to get the word out to the public. We've had cases in Kamloops where I work, for example. We put a joint letter together with our habitat staff and sent it to all property owners along the Thompson River, just to give them aware of, hey, we're here, this is what you should be doing. If you have questions, give us a call. We have officers attend trade shows, boat shows, to answer questions from the public, have pamphlets on, we have a number of pamphlets on how to, not developed by CNP, but developed by habitat staff on how to do works near waters. Schools, school talks. We've had a Crime Stoppers program at one time. We have a rewards program we work with the BC Wildlife Federation on, whereby public are encouraged to report violations and can get a reward for that. And one very good example of working together was the Shuswap Lake integrated planning process, which was on the Shuswap Lakes, where fishery officers and habitat staff worked jointly to go out and identify problem sites on the Shuswap Lake, which are a lot of small little incremental encroachment on fish habitat. So I think overall we try and do about 10% of our work as in prevention role.
DFO Jason Wong, Patrice LeBlanc, Rebecca Reed, in the course of some of their evidence, they touched on that program. Is that known as SLIP, the Shuswap program?
That's correct.
Let me ask a further question to go back to this question of Section 35 and Section 36, the DFO aligned or having responsibility for Section 35, Environment Canada having that responsibility for Section 36. My last and general question on that topic, I'll try and offer a few comments to invite your comments and your views on this. To an outsider, that sort of an arrangement with two what would appear to be closely related provisions in the Fisheries Act, in some cases provisions which may overlap, or you may have one incident or one occurrence, if you will, that would give rise to a prosecution or investigation under both offenses. Appreciating that there are arguments for and against having the two different departments and the split in responsibility. The question is, should those provisions continue to be administered as they are by separate departments, or should that be changed? Should Section 36, for example, be brought back to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans? Mr. Steele, if I might please start with you, sir.
I think in terms of clarity for the public, and in terms also of having clear accountabilities resting with one department and one minister, from the parliamentary perspective, I think there's a lot of arguments to be made to have it rest with one department or the other. I think where you run into difficulties, though, would be in looking at when it gets down to looking at the practical aspects of how it would be applied in that scenario. You run into issues of resource levels, capacity within whichever organization was to take on those added responsibilities. You would still need, I think, the close working relationship between the two, because I wouldn't see a scenario, for example, where all full responsibility for Section 36 was given over to Environment Canada, including all of the accountabilities at the ministerial level, all the rest of it, where they would just go off and implement that unilaterally. There would still be, the resource considerations that I'm referred to earlier in terms of how it would actually play itself out at the working level on the grounds, and I think there would still need to be very close working relationship and a continuing role for fishery officers under that scenario to be able to take the initial enforcement action when they come across violations. Or failing that, I guess the other scenario, if one department was to take on full responsibility, you would need to look at a shifting of resources between the two agencies, which is never something that's easy to accomplish, and usually runs into lots of debates and discussion. Usually leads nowhere, from my experience. So
It's
I
difficult.
think
I think you're saying that it's difficult to affect that sort of change. And
yes, I think looking at it at the higher level, there are a lot of arguments in favor of having it rest with one agency or the other, but the practical aspects would be difficult to work out to make that effective in practice.
Ms. Bombardier, what is your view on that question? Should these Section 35 and 36 be brought together with one department enforcing and having responsibility for both provisions?
I can only offer my own opinion, and again, it's only from the perspective of my experience with enforcement, because 36.3 involves many more activities than enforcement: research, compliance, promotion, developing regulations under 36.4. From an enforcement perspective, I can say that it's been working quite well. I know there's areas for improvements in terms of communicating our roles. to the public, to our partners. So there's room for improvement there. There's room for improvement in terms of collaboration, in joint planning, in sharing assets, equipment, those kind of things. But in my own opinion, it's been working well. Environment Canada has developed significant expertise, especially on the enforcement side, in pollution interventions. Practical aspects would need to be considered in terms of transferring that knowledge, that expertise to DFO if DFO was to decide to repatriate 36-3.
Mr. Nelson, anything to add on that question?
I'd say any kind of arrangement can work if it's properly resourced. As far as would it be better under one, I would say from the public's point of view, it probably would be easier. My personal view is it would warrant being looked at. But as Mr. Steele's indicated, it's a pretty dramatic change in the way how the two agencies would work, and it would be a difficult thing, but it's worth looking at.
Mr. Steele, I'd like to, if I might, just sort of pick up on the question of at a broad level, what the cost implications would be, for example, of a move to bring Section 36 back to DFO. And I appreciate I'm not calling you as a budgeting expert, but at a very simplistic level, it would seem that if the same work is being done, whether it's done under two agencies or one, there may be some cost involved in the transition to having one agency do it, but that if it's a matter of reallocating rather than changing the amount of work done, that would seem to be cost neutral. Now, sometimes the simplistic is simple as well and wrong. Can you comment on that at a broad level? Would it change the amount of resourcing involved to have responsibility for Section 36 moved to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
Difficult to answer without having done any real analysis on the question. I know that from past experience, whenever there's a discussion between two departments about a transfer of resources at any significant level, that usually runs into a lot of complications. The department that would be the potential people transferring resources will usually find numerous arguments to say that, you know, other activities still need to be continued, that the people that are subject to a potential transfer are carrying out other roles which would still be required within their department. People don't give up resources easily, generally speaking, and the negotiations on that kind of thing can become quite complicated and quite lengthy and protracted, and often don't lead into a successful conclusion, unless, of course, you know, if it comes down from, in this case, I guess it would almost be a cabinet level decision, or even perhaps a prime ministerial level, that, you know, as was done back in the late 70s, to say that this will happen, then obviously then it will happen. If it's left to departments to negotiate between themselves, then oftentimes the negotiations don't come to fruition, in my experience.
Ms. Bombardier, do you agree with those comments?
I'm sorry, I cannot really comment. It's beyond my level.
Mr. Commissioner, this may be a convenient point. I'm sorry, I overlooked that.
Yeah, just one additional comment. Something that would be a difficult thing to do, but something that we could probably move towards sooner rather than later would be if Environment Canada, with some of their newer staff, were to decentralize some of those and put them in joint offices with fishery officers. There might even be some cost savings. Just a suggestion. We talked about it briefly, but having them decentralized and working with our officers might be something to consider too.
Ms. Bombardier, I'll give you the option. If you'd like to take the break to reflect on that question, I can ask that after the break, or if you'd like to address that now before the break.
No, I can address it. We are very well aware of our limitations in terms of our footprint across the country. It's a very large country, and we have 180 officers approximately to cover not only Fisheries Act and the 6 regulations, pollution prevention regulations, but also all the Canadian Environmental Protection Act with its 50 or so regulations, and there's more coming up on a weekly basis. So it's quite a challenge for Environment Canada to best allocate the resources where to address the most significant issues. And so our capacity to respond in remote areas have traditionally been very limited. It has improved over the past 4 years approximately with the allocation of new resources. So as indicated earlier, we have opened new offices. Before we had an office in Vancouver, we had an office in Whitehorse. Now we have 5 offices to cover BC, which is an improvement. It's not we're not in our best situation, I would say. We have to rely a lot on our partners, but it's better than it used to be.
And the question of having Environment Canada enforcement people housed in the same place or near to the C&P fisheries officers, is that something you can comment on?
Yeah, and that we have already in a few locations, like in Prince George. I know we are in the same building in Vancouver. We are together. And we have we are in the same buildings in other areas across the country. So that's also something that we keep in mind when we look at our opening new offices, where our partners are. It's a key consideration.
Mr. Commissioner, this may be a convenient point for the break.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.